The sea south of the Solomon Islands was black and glassy, the kind of night where the horizon vanished and the stars seemed to drift on the waves. A Japanese convoy of transports and destroyers cut through the dark, their wakes glowing faintly with phosphorescent light. The men aboard smoked, joked, relaxed. They were deep inside what they considered safe waters. They called them the Emperor's Lanes. The Imperial Japanese Navy had ruled the Pacific for years now, their destroyers sweeping across the ocean with brutal precision. They'd crushed fleets, bombed bases, and humiliated every small American outpost that tried to resist. And now, as their convoy moved toward Kolombangara, under the dim glow of signal lamps, an officer on the destroyer, Kumano Maru, laughed. "They say the Americans are sending mosquito boats against us," he said. "Little wooden toys with torpedoes. Maybe they'll sting us before we sink them." The bridge erupted in chuckles. To them, it was absurd, the idea that a few small craft, barely the size of fishing boats, could threaten the Imperial Navy's steel monsters. But just after midnight, that laughter stopped. The first explosion came without warning, a white flash that split the darkness and threw a wall of flame into the sky. One of the convoy's transports erupted from below, the blast tearing its hull in half. Seconds later, another ship turned sharply, panic flashing in its signal lights, and from the edge of the Black Sea, tiny shapes appeared, 3, maybe 4, moving fast, kicking up silver wakes like knives slashing the water. The mosquito boats. Each was only 80 feet long, made of wood and armed with torpedoes no one believed could be effective. But they were coming in hard. Engines screaming, their machine guns spitting tracers across the waves. By the time the Japanese destroyers turned their guns, the boats were gone, vanished into the dark, their Packard engines howling as they disappeared beyond radar range. In the smoke and confusion, an officer on the Kumano Maru could only whisper, "What were those things?" Hours later, when dawn broke, the ocean was littered with burning wreckage. 2 Japanese transports were gone. Another destroyer limped home, stern shattered. And for the first time, the Imperial Navy, the most powerful sea force in the world, had been bloodied by something it couldn't understand. Tiny, wooden boats. They had called them toys. Now, they called them demons. But their story didn't begin in those dark waters. It began years earlier, in American shipyards, where no one, not even the Navy itself, believed in them. In the late 1932, long before the Pacific War began, the U.S. Navy had a problem. It needed something new, a weapon that could fight close to shore, fast enough to chase submarines, small enough to move unseen. But the Navy was old-fashioned. Admirals loved battleships, 30,000 tons of steel, hundreds of crew, big guns and bigger egos. To them, the idea of a small wooden boat fighting in open waters sounded like a joke. When the idea of a motor torpedo boat was first proposed, one officer famously said, "You might as well arm a canoe." Still, the Navy opened a competition. Several companies joined. Elko in New Jersey, Higgins Industries in New Orleans, and Huckins Yacht Corporation in Florida. Each was told to design a fast patrol boat, something that could launch torpedoes, outrun destroyers, and survive in rough seas. The tests were brutal. The Navy pitted prototypes against each other in simulated combat near the Florida Keys. Boats smashed through waves, engines blew out, hulls cracked. Most designs failed spectacularly, but one didn't. The Elko 80-foot boat built by the Electric Launch Company stunned everyone. It was long, sleek, and fast. Its triple Packard V12 engines produced over 4,000 horsepower, pushing the boat to 45 knots, about 52 miles per hour across open water. It was made entirely of laminated mahogany, not steel, which made it light, flexible, and easier to repair. It could carry 4 torpedoes, several machine guns, and later even a 20mm cannon on its deck. It was, in every sense, the opposite of a battleship, small, fragile, and cheap. But to the few young sailors who volunteered to crew them, it was love at first sight. They called them PT boats, short for patrol torpedo boats, and nicknamed them the Mosquito Fleet. Most Navy veterans laughed when they saw them. "You'll be dead in a week," one commander told a group of trainees. He wasn't entirely wrong. Early PT boats had problems. The torpedoes misfired, the hulls leaked, and the gasoline engines turned every mission into a floating bomb. A single tracer could ignite the fuel tanks and vaporize the whole boat, but those who sailed them didn't care. They were adrenaline junkies, young, reckless, often barely out of college. They liked danger, they liked speed, and they liked the idea that they were doing something the rest of the Navy was too afraid to try. One early skipper described it best. The PT boat was a mix of beauty and terror, a mahogany coffin with a steering wheel. Then, in December 1941, everything changed. Pearl Harbor was bombed. The Pacific erupted into war. And suddenly, the U.S. Navy needed everything it could get that could move and fight, even the little boats they used to laugh at. Within weeks, the first PT squadrons were deployed untested, underarmed, and unafraid. Their orders were simple: find the enemy, strike fast, disappear. No one, not even the Japanese, knew yet that these floating mosquitoes would soon become one of the most feared weapons in the Pacific. By the spring of 1942, the Pacific was burning. The Philippines had fallen. Japanese bombers ruled the skies. And what was left of the American Navy in the region was scattered, bleeding, and outnumbered. In the chaos of that retreat, there was one small unit the Japanese barely noticed: a handful of wooden boats tied up at a pier in the Bataan Peninsula. They were part of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3, commanded by a wiry, tough-talking lieutenant named John D. Bulkley. Bulkley was 32 years old, brash, and fearless, the kind of man who could stare down a battleship and grin. He loved his PT boats like family, even when they barely ran. By March 1942, he had only 6 boats left, half crippled from months of fighting and constant repairs. They were patched with tin, plywood, and sometimes chewing gum. Fuel was scarce, ammunition was running out, and food was down to rice and canned rations. But when General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme Allied commander of the Pacific, needed to escape from the Philippines, it wasn't a battleship or submarine that would carry him out. It was Bulkley's Mosquito Fleet. Under orders to evacuate MacArthur, his wife, and staff from the island fortress of Corregidor, Bulkley set out across the Mindanao Sea, one of the most dangerous waters in the Pacific, crawling with Japanese ships and aircraft. The weather turned rough rain, wind, the kind of storm that could flip a destroyer. The PT boats bucked and slammed into the waves, their wooden hulls groaning. On the second night, one boat's engine caught fire. Another nearly ran out of fuel. Yet they pressed on. Bulkley himself stood at the helm of PT-41, soaked to the bone, refusing to sleep. He knew one flare in the sky could expose them. One mistake and the Japanese would be on them within minutes. But somehow, they made it through. After 600 miles of open ocean, the convoy reached safety in Mindanao. MacArthur, exhausted but alive, stepped off the PT boat and said one line that would become legend: "I shall return." Bulkley and his men had done the impossible. They'd smuggled the most important general in the Pacific out of enemy territory, right under the nose of the Imperial Navy, using 6 wooden boats. When news reached Washington, the PT boats were no longer a joke. They were heroes. Hollywood made a movie about Bulkley's mission. They were expendable. The American public saw them as the ultimate underdogs: small, fast, defiant. And the Japanese Navy, watching from across the Pacific, began to take notice. Because those same mosquito boats were multiplying fast. By the summer of 1943, entire squadrons of PT boats prowled the waters of the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Bismarck Sea. And that's where the real war began. The Solomon Islands at night were hell. The heat hung thick and wet, the air buzzing with insects, and the sea glowing faintly from plankton disturbed by passing ships. This was PT boat country: narrow channels, island chains, and endless darkness. Every night, Japanese destroyers and transports, the so-called Tokyo Express, ran supplies to their garrisons, under cover of darkness. And every night, the PT boats hunted them. They'd lie still near the mouth of a channel, engines idling, crews whispering, sweat dripping down their backs. The radar screens glowed faintly primitive by today's standards, but enough to pick up a shadow 10 miles away. When a target appeared, the skipper gave a quiet order. Engines ahead 1/3. The Packard V-12 seconds rumbled to life, low and deep, like the growl of a predator. Each man took his position, one on the torpedo launchers, one on the twin. 50 caliber guns, another on the wheel. They moved in fast. At 40 knots, the PT boat skipped across the surface, slamming into waves so hard that men were thrown from their seats. Spray covered everything. Their eyes watered from salt and gasoline fumes. Then they saw the outline of a Japanese destroyer, its bow slicing through the moonlight. Fire one. The first torpedo streaked away, cutting a silver trail through the dark water. Then another. Then a third. The destroyer spotted them and opened fire. Tracers sliced the night, splashing into the sea. Close, too close. The PT boat turned hard, engines screaming. Hang on. The torpedoes hit. A flash lit the sky, an explosion so massive it sent a wave rolling back toward them. The destroyer's hull split open, fire gushing out like molten metal. The PT crew cheered for a second, then ducked as more shells screamed overhead. They doused lights, gunned the engines, and vanished into the jungle Black Sea. By dawn, the destroyer was gone. That's how the PT boats fought, fast, furious, and unseen. They couldn't win by brute force. They won by audacity. They were like a swarm of wasps, stinging at the edges of a giant. Every night, Japanese convoys grew more paranoid. Ships began zigzagging, wasting fuel, afraid of shadows on the water. And the admirals who once mocked the little American boats began issuing orders to stay clear of certain bays and inlets because something was out there. Something they couldn't catch. Something that could kill them before they even saw it. By the end of 1943, Japanese losses to PT boats were mounting transport ships, barges, even destroyers sunk or crippled. But what made the boats truly terrifying wasn't just their speed. It was the men who drove them. They were fearless, and sometimes reckless enough to turn the tide of entire battles. One of them would soon become a national legend, not for what he sank, but for what he survived. His name was John F. Kennedy, commander of PT 109, and his story would make the entire world take the PT boats seriously. By 1943, Lieutenant John F. Kennedy was 26 years old, tall, sharp-featured, and still walking with a slight limp from an old back injury. He wasn't supposed to be a hero. He was the son of a powerful American ambassador, rich, educated, and destined for politics. But when war came, he volunteered for the Navy, asking for combat duty. He didn't want a desk. He wanted danger, and he got it. In the Solomon Islands, he was given command of a small, worn-out PT boat, PT 109. The crew was young, most barely in their 20s. They lived in sweat and salt, sleeping under mosquito nets, eating canned rations, and constantly fighting off engine problems, heat, and exhaustion. But they loved their skipper. Kennedy didn't lead from behind. He got dirty with them, cracked jokes, and shared their misery. He even swam under the boat one night to clear tangled debris from the propellers himself, while Japanese aircraft droned overhead. To the men, he wasn't Lieutenant Kennedy. He was Jack. By August 1st, 1943, PT 109 was stationed near Blackett Strait, patrolling the dark waters between Kolombangara and New Georgia. The mission: intercept Japanese destroyers running the Tokyo Express fast night convoys carrying troops and supplies. It was a moonless night. The sea was pitch black, flat as glass. Radar was limited, visibility nearly zero. The only sounds were the low hum of the Packard engines and the distant echo of thunder. Just after 2:30 a.m., Kennedy and his crew spotted what they thought was a faint wake on the water, a shadow moving fast. Before they could react, a 300-foot-long destroyer, the Yamagiri, burst out of the darkness. It was moving at 40 knots, a steel wall cutting straight across their path. Kennedy shouted, "Hard to port!" But there was no time. The destroyer's bow slammed into PT-109 with a deafening crunch, splitting it in half. The explosion threw men into the water like rag dolls. Flames shot up from the fuel tanks, lighting the night in a hellish orange glow. 2 crewmen were killed instantly. 11 others, including Kennedy, were scattered across the sea. The Amagiri vanished into the dark, unaware that it had nearly killed the future president of the United States. The survivors clung to debris, coughing up seawater, their bodies burned and bruised. Kennedy, bleeding from his back and exhausted, gathered whoever he could find. The current was strong, pulling them farther from the wreckage. They were adrift miles from land, in enemy-controlled waters, surrounded by sharks. At dawn, they could see a faint outline of an island on the horizon. Kennedy made a decision. He bit down on the strap of a wounded sailor's life jacket and started swimming, towing the man with his teeth. For 5 hours, he swam through open ocean. 5 hours. When they finally reached the reef, they crawled onto the sand and collapsed. PT-109 was gone. Their radios were gone, and the Japanese controlled everything around them. The little boats had once been a symbol of speed and victory. Now they were a handful of survivors on a forgotten island, trying to stay alive. For 6 days, Kennedy and his crew hid among the palm trees and mangroves of Olasana Island, living off coconuts and rainwater. During the day, they stayed hidden from Japanese patrol boats passing nearby. At night, they swam out, searching for rescue. Kennedy refused to give up. Every night he swam miles through pitch-black waters trying to flag down other PT boats. He carried a small signal lantern, but no one ever saw it. The salt water burned his eyes, his lips cracked, his body was covered in blisters. But he kept going. On the 4th day, the men spotted 2 native Coast Watchers islanders working secretly with the Allies. Kennedy carved a message onto a coconut shell. Noro Isel, Commander. Native knows position. He can pilot. 11 alive. Needs small boat. He gave the coconut to one of the islanders, who paddled it across miles of ocean to an Allied outpost. 2 days later, a PT boat appeared offshore. Kennedy swam out one last time, through the surf, to guide it in. The rescue crew pulled him aboard, exhausted, shaking, but alive. When the survivors were brought back to base, word spread fast. The skipper who swam through shark-infested waters, who towed a wounded man with his teeth, who kept his crew alive for a week on coconuts, was a Kennedy. In Washington, the story made headlines. The Navy awarded him the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for heroism and the Purple Heart for his injuries. But for Kennedy, the experience wasn't about medals. He had seen what courage looked like not just in himself, but in the men who refused to quit. Years later, when he ran for president, the press would ask him about PT-109. He'd smile faintly and say, "It was involuntary. They sank my boat." The remark became famous, modest, witty, perfectly Kennedy. But behind that joke was something deeper, the memory of 11 men who turned a disaster into a legend. After PT-109, the world never looked at the PT fleet the same way again. They were no longer little boats. They were the Navy's knife in the dark. By late 1944, hundreds of PT boats prowled the coasts of New Guinea, the Philippines, and Borneo, hitting supply lines, ambushing barges, cutting off reinforcements. The Japanese began calling them devil boats, because they came out of nowhere, struck hard, and vanished before you could return fire. Every admiral who once laughed at them now feared the sound of their engines in the night. And that was the irony. The same cheap plywood boats that had been mocked in Tokyo and dismissed in Washington were now bleeding the Imperial Navy dry, one convoy at a time. By late 1944, the tables had turned. The United States Navy had returned to the Philippines. The mighty fleets that once fled east were now coming back west, aircraft carriers, battleships, and endless supply lines stretching across the Pacific. And ahead of them, always, were the PT boats. They were the first to enter enemy bays, the first to attack convoys, and often, the first to die. Their mission wasn't about glory anymore, it was about attrition. They hunted Japanese supply ships, troop barges, and fuel convoys that kept the island garrisons alive. Every torpedo that hit meant one less barge of food, one less crate of ammunition, one more stranded unit of soldiers cut off from Tokyo. The Japanese Navy began calling the American PT fleet Yasen Butai no Oni, the demons of the night battle. In the narrow inlets and shallow waters where destroyers couldn't go, PT boats ruled. At night, the ocean turned into chaos, torpedoes streaking through the dark, tracer fire bouncing across the waves, and wooden boats darting between columns of flame. They became ghosts striking, vanishing, striking again. At one battle off Ormoc Bay, Japanese transports tried to unload troops under the cover of darkness, but a squadron of PT boats ambushed them, weaving between burning ships, firing torpedoes at point-blank range. By dawn, 6 enemy transports were gone. Thousands of troops never made it to shore, and the PT boats slipped away, black with soot, their crews exhausted. Barely alive but victorious, the Imperial Navy, once proud and unstoppable, had been reduced to fragments. Admirals who once commanded great fleets now hid their ships by day, terrified of what waited for them at night. Because every explosion in the dark, every sudden torpedo strike, every streak of flame on the horizon could mean only one thing. The Mosquito fleet was nearby. The Japanese propaganda that once mocked the PT boats as toys for American children playing at war disappeared quietly. They had learned the hard way that those children had grown into wolves. When the war ended in 1945, the Pacific went quiet. The PT boats returned to their docks one last time, scorched, bullet-riddled, and battle-weary. Many were too damaged to bring home. They were stripped, set ablaze, and sunk offshore to make room for newer ships. The Navy called it disposal. The men who had served on them called it something else, a funeral, but their spirit didn't sync with them. Because the lessons learned from those wooden boats, speed, surprise, precision, would shape naval warfare for decades. The Navy realized that sometimes, small wins battles the big never could. That you didn't always need armor to survive, just courage, agility, and timing. In Korea and later in Vietnam, new generations of fast attack craft carried that same DNA. Small hulls, big guns, fearless crews. Every man who stepped onto one of those boats knew the name PT. And somewhere in the Pacific, the wrecks of the originals still lie under coral and sand, their aluminum frames slowly fading, but their stories still alive in every sailor who dares the dark. As for John F. Kennedy, he never forgot the night PT-109 went down. When he became president, he kept that carved coconut shell, the one that saved his crew on his desk in the Oval Office. It wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder. That war isn't won only by the strongest ships or the biggest guns, but by the men willing to risk everything in the smallest ones. The Japanese Navy had learned that lesson the hard way. The world learned it too. Because from the black waters of the Solomon Islands to the beaches of the Philippines, the hum of those little Packard engines echoed one truth across the ocean. That courage doesn't always come in steel and armor. Sometimes, it comes in plywood and paint. Sometimes, it comes in the form of a few reckless Americans, charging into the dark, in a boat small enough to fit in a barn, and changing the course of a war.